Well, welcome to the Catholic Reason, a radio production of St. Michael Catholic Radio based here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, where we think through various claims made by the Catholic Church concerning issues of faith, morality, and sometimes culture, and provide reasons behind those claims. Hence the title of the show, The Catholic Reason. I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard, staff apologist and speaker for Catholic Answers at Catholic.com, and a member of the Chancery Evangelization Team here at the Diocese of Tulsa and Eastern Oklahoma. The Catholic Reason airs locally here in Tulsa every Thursday from 4 to 5 p.m. on St. Michael Catholic Radio, 94.9 and 102.9, and across the entire Oklahoma radio network of 15 stations, including 97.3 FM in Oklahoma City, 100.9 in Edmond, and 88.3 FM in Lawton. But you may be listening at a different time on your own local Catholic station outside Oklahoma, since the Catholic Reason is aired on other Catholic stations throughout the country. Regardless of where you're at and where you're listening from, a very special welcome to you, and thanks for joining me today. Remember, you can download the show through whichever podcast platform that you use by subscribing to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast, and you can also access the archived episodes at my website, karlobroussard.com, under both the audio and video tab. In today's episode, we're going to look at a pretty big topic, and that is sexual ethics. So a little forewarning to anyone who is listening, if there are kids around, please know that we're going to be talking about this issue. In particular, I want to think through two modern principles that many within contemporary culture base their sexual ethic on. And just think through it. And I'm going to submit to you that there are some problems with these modern principles, these modern sexual principles. The first is the idea that consent alone is sufficient for sexual behavior to be morally appropriate. So all you need is consent. As long as you got that, all things go, right? And of course, this is going to lead to a discussion about why consent, even though consent alone as a sufficient condition for morally appropriate sexual behavior is not right, it does prompt a question as to why consent is necessary in the first place. So we do agree that consent is a necessary condition for appropriate sexual behavior. But what we're going to challenge is the idea that consent alone is sufficient for morally appropriate sexual behavior. And the second modern ethical principle that many live by is the idea that sexual acts are morally permissible so long as it doesn't hurt anyone, right? So no harm, no foul, as the saying goes. So let's start with that first principle. Consent alone is sufficient for appropriate sexual behavior. Now, note that everything I say here is in written form in my article, quote, "The Moral Limits of Consent," close quote, at Catholic.com. That's the title of the article. And this sexual ethic became most evident within our culture during the events involving accusations of sexual assault, harassment, and rape against Hollywood's elite, what has now become known as the Weinstein effect. Harvey Weinstein and others like him who pleaded innocent of charges claimed that his actions were justified because the sexual acts were consensual. A survey conducted by the Harris Poll found that 76% of employed U.S. adults, whether full-time or part-time, thought that the hashtag #MeToo movement, which was the movement that developed based upon these events, was on the right path and had made a positive impact on cutting down sexual harassment in the workplace. Others have touted this opposition to sexual coercion as the guiding light within the sexual arena. For example, at her 2018 Golden Globes speech, Oprah Winfrey used her pulpit to target the growing phenomenon of sexual harassment by Hollywood's elite, saying, quote, for too long, women have not been heard or believed if they dare to speak their truth to the power of those men, but their time is up, their time is up, their time is up, close quote. John Oliver, a British host of the HBO late night series entitled Last Week Tonight, said, quote, "Sex is like boxing. If both people didn't fully agree to participate, one of them is committing a crime," close quote. So we have a plethora of examples within the modern culture that appeals to the sexual ethical principle that consent is a necessary condition for appropriate sexual behavior. But undergirding all of these instances is the idea that consent alone seems to be the sufficient condition, as long as consent is there. And if that's there, then the sexual behavior is appropriate. Now, I agree with all of the previous statements that I just shared with you insofar as they condemn sexual coercion. Sexual coercion is morally wrong and a crime. And that's definitely a sexual ethic worth abiding by. And more on this later in today's episode. I will try to provide a rational justification as to why sexual coercion is wrong. That's to say, why consent is at least a necessary condition for appropriate sexual behavior, as opposed to it being the sole sufficient condition. But even though we condemn sexual coercion and these statements within contemporary culture are correct insofar as they condemn sexual coercion, it's the modern spin that's given to this ethical principle that's problematic. Namely, that the behavior is seen to be justified simply because it's consensual. That's where the problem lies, so I argue. This precisely was Weinstein's arguments against the accusations made against him. For Weinstein and others who think like him, consent is the sufficient criterion for morally appropriate human behavior. Sufficient. That means that's all you need, as opposed to just a necessary condition along with other conditions. And this provides us an opportunity to pause and reflect. Is consent the only moral criterion for evaluating sexual behavior? And when you think it through, so I'm going to argue today, it becomes clear that there must be something more than consent. There's got to be something more than consent that's driving the moral evaluation of appropriate sexual behavior. Now, one reason why the appeal to consent alone in sexual morality is problematic is that we don't buy this ethical principle when it comes to other behaviors. Take self-injury, for example. A young girl might voluntarily cut herself because she experiences pleasure in doing so and perceives it as a fulfilling part of her life. But yet, in that case, we wouldn't say that's morally justified simply because the young girl consents to it. Some transabled persons desire to have a doctor render them paraplegic or to have a healthy limb amputated, and transabled is quote-unquote transabled. But just because these persons consent to such acts, even with full knowledge of the effects, it doesn't mean they're morally justified. We also don't apply this principle, the consent alone principle, when it comes to behaviors that involve others. Consider the absurd example of Armin Muse, who butchered and ate a willing victim that responded to his internet ad. That someone says yes doesn't make cannibalism morally permissible. Sometimes people consent to things that are bad for them, but in such examples, consent is not what's driving the moral evaluation. In all the previous examples, people will intuitively recognize those are inappropriate human behaviors, even though there is consent. So consent is not what's driving the moral evaluation. What's in the driver's seat is a more fundamental underlying moral theory that says these behaviors are bad, and thus they need to be avoided. To state it differently, these behaviors are immoral, and thus need to be avoided. Now, if there is a more fundamental framework that does the evaluative work, well, then it logically follows that consent by itself is not sufficient to to morally justify some activity. So, to the question, is consent alone sufficient? Well, we can answer no, at least based upon so far the moral intuitions that we don't follow this ethical principle when it comes to other matters. Just because somebody consents to something doesn't make it morally justifiable. We gave the example of the young girl. Just because she consents to cutting herself doesn't mean cutting herself is a morally permitted behavior and something good for her, something that she ought to be doing. Just because people consent to being butchered and eaten by another human being doesn't make cannibalism morally justifiable, right? And also, I mentioned the quote-unquote transabled people. I'm thinking of one lady by the name of Chloe Jennings White, a smart lady with degrees from Stanford and one other university. I think it might be Cambridge, if I'm not mistaken. But she has expressed publicly in interviews that she has the desire for a doctor to sever her sciatic nerve in order to be paraplegic. And so she goes around riding in a wheelchair with leg braces on her legs because she identifies as a paraplegic. But just because she consents to that doesn't mean the behavior is morally justifiable. So we see that this principle is not used and followed in other areas, in other matters. So too, we shouldn't follow it when it comes to sexual behavior. Now, there are a couple of counter arguments that critics may pose to the line of reasoning that I've gone through so far, but we're going to have to wait and address those on the other side of the break. Friends, I'm coming up on a break, so stay tuned. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard. Stay tuned. Well, welcome back, my friends, to The Catholic Reason, a radio production of St. Michael Catholic Radio based here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. And in today's episode, we're looking at some problems with modern sexual ethics. And one particular sexual ethic principle that we started to look at in segment 1 of today's episode is the idea that consent alone is sufficient. It's a sufficient condition for morally appropriate sexual behavior. Now, we began to challenge that modern sexual principle and offer response to it by saying, well, listen, we don't follow this ethical principle with other behaviors. I gave the example of a young girl cutting herself. I gave the example of a quote-unquote transabled person who has a body integrity identity disorder, who people want to have their limbs cut off in order to match visibly what they perceive themselves to be, namely paraplegic or not having a limb. And so we say, well, intuitively we recognize just because they consent to it doesn't make that behavior morally permissible. We use the example of cannibalism. Just because people consent to being eaten by another human being, we recognize that doesn't make the behavior morally justifiable or permissible. Now, a critic may very well counter and respond and say, well, someone who consents to being killed and eaten, like in cannibalism, must be mentally ill. And I sympathize with that counter. But here's the question. Why must we draw that conclusion? Why say they're mentally ill for this particular behavior? We can only judge that someone has a mental illness if they're desiring some sort of behavior that we think is wrong, is because we first believe that the behavior, the choices for the behavior are disordered. So I'm going to state that again. We can only judge that someone has a mental illness and has a disordered desire for some behavior if we first believe that the behavior they're desiring or choosing to engage in is, first of all, disordered and bad for us as a human being. But disordered or bad choices and behavior can only be evaluated based on a presupposed moral standard that determines what ordered and good choices are, what ordered behavior and good choices are. And of course, this undermines the idea that choice by itself is not the sole moral criterion, or to state it differently, consent alone is not the sole moral criterion. Because as we've indicated, some choices are made for behaviors that we recognize to be wrong. Like in the case of cannibalism, Critic says they're mentally ill. Well, why is that? Because you first have already judged that the behavior of cannibalism is gravely disordered and contrary to our good and thus immoral. And so it's not the choice doing the moral evaluation. It's the presupposed moral standard by which you judge the behavior to be contrary to human good. Now, in one last attempt to avoid the problems of the consent-based ethic or the consent-alone-based ethic, a critic might just bite the bullet and acknowledge that the self-destructive behaviors that I used as examples earlier are morally permissible. In his mind, each person has a moral right to determine how he lives his life, even if the lifestyle is counterintuitive to modern moral sensibilities, so he might say. Now, this sort of counter-argument, admittedly, successfully dodges my previous critique, since my critique appeals to moral intuitions. We intuitively recognize a girl cutting her wrist is bad. We intuitively recognize perfectly healthy people cutting off their limbs is bad. We intuitively recognize cannibalism as bad. But for many, giving up in response to this critic who says, well, I'll just bite the bullet and say that's okay. For many, giving up moral intuitions might be too high of a price to pay. They realize that our moral intuition can be a source of wisdom for us, and it keeps most people intact along with their limbs, right? Moral intuition shouldn't be discarded so lightly, even though I would argue it's not the best foundation upon which to build a moral system, because those intuitions need justification. But a critique of the consent alone based ethic doesn't have to rely on intuition alone. There's another moral fundamental problem. It fails to understand the nature of consent and how it works. And now we're at the heart of the consent alone based ethical principle. Consider this. When I consent to you performing an activity, I basically confer a stamp of approval for you to perform the act. And otherwise, I authorize you to act accordingly. But my consent has no legitimizing power unless the activity that I authorize is actually subject to my authorization, right? It's actually something I can authorize. Suppose, for example, that I tell you, you have my permission to steal your neighbor's car. And we kind of chuckle at that, right? Because my consent would not thereby give justification to the act, because I don't have the right to authorize it in the first place. I don't have a right to authorize that behavior because my neighbor's car is not subject to my authority. Valid consent, therefore, is not valid by the mere fact of consent. Rather, it requires a pre-existing right to authorize a course of action. So it's not consent alone. There's something more than consent that's even going to give consent the legitimizing power. So for consent to have any moral legitimizing power, it requires a pre-existing moral standard that determines which behaviors we are morally allowed to consent to. You might think of our consent's moral power as being on loan. Its currency derived from a deeper or presupposed moral standard. To state it bluntly, you can't consent to a behavior unless the behavior is first good for us as a human being and morally permissible. So it's not consent doing the moral evaluation and driving the moral evaluation. It's the more presupposed fundamental moral standard that determines the behavior to which we need to consent to, or we're thinking about consenting to, is good for us. Then we can consent to it. But if the behavior is bad for us, well, then we don't have a right to consent to it, morally speaking. To say that consent by itself makes a behavior morally permissible, it's like saying a police officer's commands have normative force just because they're commands. But we recognize that a police officer's commands are meaningful not just because they're commands, but only inasmuch as he's allowed to make such commands given his position of authority. Similarly, our consent has moral significance only inasmuch as the behaviors that we authorize are already morally permissible, given some moral framework. Of course, what that moral framework is, well, that's going to need to be worked out. I claim it's the natural moral law. But that there must be a more fundamental presupposed moral framework that gives consent the power to make something morally permissible, we must admit. And that's my point here. If consent has moral significance only on account of a more fundamental moral framework, well, then it's futile to appeal to consent alone in establishing the moral permissibility of sexual acts. It's seeking moral power where no moral power can be found. It's going to an empty well. Now, please hear me. This is not to say that consent has no role to play in a moral evaluation. The victims of the sexual assault cases, along with the defendants, are right inasmuch that they're appealing to consent in order to evaluate the alleged behavior. As I mentioned earlier, consent is a necessary condition for a sexual act to be morally upright. Our contention here is just that it's not sufficient for the reasons that I've been spelling out so far. Now, this raises an interesting question. Why is consent necessary in the first place? And it's this question that I'd like to turn to now. So we're to the topic of why consent matters. So far we've seen that consent alone is not sufficient for appropriate sexual behavior. Nevertheless, it is a necessary condition, so we've said. But why must it be a necessary condition? And this is very fruitful reflection, as you'll see in a few moments. Now, recall, or note, I should say, everything I say here is in written form as well in my article, The Moral Logic of Sexual Consent, at Catholic.com. So be sure to check out the written version of what I say here. And I think we can start with, the Weinstein effect that I appealed to previously provided us with an opportunity to think through the role of consent in establishing the morality of sexual acts. And of course, as I stated, we looked at reasons why consent by itself is not enough. These news stories give us reason to wonder why consent is even necessary for establishing the moral permissibility of sexual activity. Or to put it negatively, why is sexual coercion wrong? That it is wrong is something that's been assumed in all of those cases within our modern culture concerning sexual coercion. And we agree, as I stated earlier, sexual coercion is wrong, but why? And in thinking through the answer to that question is going to provide very fruitful for us in evaluating sexual behavior. When we think through these questions, we discover that the implicit moral standard by which our secular culture judges sexual coercion to be immoral is the same standard that condemns those sexual acts that our culture thinks are morally acceptable, like fornication, contraception, masturbation, and sexual activity between members of the same sex. But since people don't normally articulate the moral theory that underlies their condemnation of sexual coercion, it needs to be teased out. And that is what we're going to do on the other side of the break. Stay tuned. Well, welcome back, my friends, to the Catholic Reason, a radio production of St. Michael Catholic Radio, based here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard, staff apologist and speaker for Catholic Answers at Catholic.com, and a member of the Chancery Evangelization team here at the Diocese of Tulsa and Eastern Oklahoma. In today's episode, we're thinking through a variety of problems with modern sexual ethics. One of the common modern sexual ethical principles that we've been looking at is consent alone is sufficient for sexual behavior to be morally appropriate. And in response, we said, no, that's not the case because we don't follow that ethical principle with other behaviors. So most people just aren't consistent with the principle. And then secondly, we identified a more fundamental problem with that principle, namely that consent only has legitimizing power insofar as there's a presupposed moral standard that determines a behavior to be worthy of consent, permissible for consent. And if that's the case, then consent by itself cannot be a sufficient condition for appropriate human behavior, and in particular, appropriate sexual human behavior. Now, in our last segment, we began to ask and began to answer the question, why is consent even necessary in the first place? Because we acknowledge that consent is a necessary condition for evaluating the appropriateness of sexual human behavior. It's just not the sufficient condition. But why is it necessary in the first place? And so we began to look at that question before our last break, and that's what we're going to pick up with now. And so I was mentioning how the Weinstein effect that I appealed to previously in the episode provided us with an opportunity to think through the role of consent in establishing the morality of sexual acts. But we saw it's not enough. But the news stories, of course, give us reason to wonder, why is it necessary in the first place? And here's what's interesting, or so I hope to show you. When we ask the question, why is sexual coercion wrong? When we think through that sort of question, we discover that the implicit moral standard by which our secular culture judges sexual coercion to be immoral is the same standard that condemns those sexual acts that our culture thinks are morally acceptable, like fornication, contraception, masturbation, and sexual activity between members of the same sex. But since people normally don't articulate the moral theory that underlies their condemnation of sexual coercion, it needs to be teased out. Now, perhaps the very first thing that we notice about ourselves as human beings is that we're free. Unlike an arrow, say, that's moved to its target by an archer, and unlike an animal that's directed entirely by instincts, we humans have a power by which we're able to freely move ourselves to an end or a goal. St. Thomas talks about this in his Summa Theologiae, the first part, the first part of the second part of his Summa Theologiae, question 1, article 2. And I like how philosopher Scott Sullivan puts it in his An Introduction to Catholic Sexual Morality. We are, quote unquote, natural-born end choosers. We're hardwired to choose in virtue of some end or goal. Now, this power, called free will, follows upon our power of reason. When we act based on a judgment that something should be pursued, like it's a good, or avoided, because I perceive it to be bad. And as St. Thomas points out in his Summa Theologiae, first part, question 83, article 1, because this judgment is not from natural instinct, but from some act of comparison in the reason, we act from free judgment and retain the power being inclined to various other things. Now, our self-determining power, therefore, is due to our nature as a rational being. I'm going to repeat that. That's the key. Our self-determining power belongs to our nature as rational beings. And it's this rational part of our nature that separates human beings from all other creatures in the material world. Herein lies the reason why unjust coercion, and in particular sexual coercion, is immoral. To unjustly impede someone from self-determination is to violate a person's human dignity. It's to act against human nature. It sees a person's humanity as an evil to be avoided, and thus reduces a person to something lower than a human, a tool, an object for use. Now, the reason why I said unjust coercion is because I acknowledge that there are some cases where physical coercion is justified, such as in the case of a parent-child relationship. Sometimes you have to physically coerce the child, right? Because they are unable to govern their own behavior. Self-defense, when I have to defend myself and detain an aggressor, I physically coerce him. Or criminal punishment by imprisonment and or even death. Now, just as a side note, for a detailed study on the death part of that punishment, check out Edward Fazer and Joseph Bassett's book, By Man Shall His Blood Be Shed, A Catholic Defense of Capital Punishment, published by Ignatius Press. And then also philosopher Stephen Jensen's book, Good and Evil Actions, A Journey Through St. Thomas Aquinas, published by the Catholic University of America Press in 2010. Check out those resources for capital punishment. Pope St. John Paul II had a bit to say about unjust coercion as well, following upon Aquinas' teaching in his commentary on the Book of Sentences, Book 2, Distinction 44, Question 1, Article 3, for all of these, response to Objection 1 if you're taking notes. Pope St. John Paul II, as Karol Wojtyła in his book Love and Responsibility, unequivocally asserted the immorality of using a person as a mere means. That would be acting against the humanity of the person, right? Here's what he writes, quote, anyone who treats a person as the means to an end does violence to the very essence of the other, to what constitutes its natural right. So to unjustly impede someone from utilizing their self-determining power is to do violence against their rational nature. In light of this, it shouldn't be hard to see why sexual coercion is immoral. It directs a person to an end or a goal that he doesn't consent to, but that he should be free to consent to, namely sexual activity. And since it's a violation of a person's human nature to unjustly direct him to an end that he doesn't consent to when he should, it follows that sexual coercion does violence to the nature of the person who is being coerced. It does violence to human nature. Now, the traditional sexual moralist is very happy at this point. Everything I've said of how sexual coercion does violence to the dignity of the human person has been and is affirmed by people within our modern culture. All of those who jumped on the hashtag #MeToo movement. The discussion thus far brings to the fore the underlying moral theory here that we as a traditional sexual moralist would be happy to hear. Nature determines moral norms for human action. I'm going to repeat that. Nature determines, our human nature, more specifically, our human nature determines moral norms for human action. The argument that sex must be consensual is grounded in, rooted in what a human being is, in particular, in the rational dimension of human nature, since it appeals to intellect and will, like we're self-determining beings, we're free, and we ought to be able to exercise that free will and that power within the sphere, within the sexual arena. But our human nature doesn't involve only rationality. Guess what? As we all know, from our own experience, it also involves animality, bodily sensations, appetites, emotions, etc. This is why Aristotle and those following him, like St. Thomas, defined a human being as a rational animal. Now, since the subject of human morals is a human being, and since a human being by essence has both rationality and animality, it follows that the shape of human morals ought to be determined not only by the patterns that belong to the form of our rational life, but also by the specific form or patterns of our animal life. And this, my friends, is where our sexuality comes into play. Our sexed bodies flow from the animal side of our nature. And if our animality participates in determining moral norms for human action, well, then our sexed bodies, along with what they're designed for, procreation or reproduction and unitive love, ought to participate in determining moral norms as well. We can look to the nature of our sexual powers to determine which sexual acts are immoral, just as we look to the nature of our free will to determine that unjust coercion is immoral. Unjust coercion, and in particular sexual coercion, does violence to the natural design of a person's free will because it unjustly impedes the exercise of self-determination. Similarly, the sexual acts that our secular culture deems morally permissible do violence to the natural design of our sexual powers. The variety of different acts militate against what our sexual powers are for, namely procreation and the rearing of children. And inasmuch as they violate the good of procreation, such as same-sex sexual activity, masturbation, and the rearing of children, such as fornication, they violate the unitive purpose of sex as well, since you can only have a loving union if you will what is good for the beloved. So there's hope for our sex-crazed culture after all. But I'm going to have to hit the pause button. More on this on the other side of the break. Don't go anywhere. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. Well, welcome back, my friends, to our last and final segment of today's episode of The Catholic Reason, where we're looking at some problems of modern sexual ethics. We've looked at one sexual ethic principle, that consent alone is sufficient for appropriate human sexual behavior. And we gave some reasons why that is not the case, and that is false. Although consent is a necessary condition, it is not a sufficient condition for appropriate human sexual behavior. And then we also looked at we also began to ask and answer the question, why is consent necessary in the first place? And we've come to the answer so far that it is necessary because we are self-determining beings. Our self-determining powers are rooted within our nature as human beings. So to unjustly coerce a human being is to do violence against human nature. Sexual coercion is an unjust coercion because freedom must be present for sexual activity. And so therefore, sexual coercion does violence against human nature. Now, as I was pointing out in our last segment, the underlying moral theory there is that our human nature determines what is appropriate and inappropriate human behavior. And so once we have that realized, there's hope, after all, for our sex-crazed culture. The appeal to our human nature, and in particular its rational part, to condemn sexual coercion actually opens wide the doors for the animal part of our nature, and in particular our sex bodies, to also play a role in the moral evaluation of sexual behavior, which allows for us to assess how some sexual behaviors that our modern culture approves of are actually immoral, because they too involve violence against our human nature. So if our culture is going to embrace human nature when it comes to determining the moral status of sexual coercion, then to be consistent, it's going to have to also embrace human nature, including our sexed bodies and their design and what they're for, to determining the moral status of fornication, contraception, masturbation, and sexual activity between members of the same sex. So the idea is our culture can't reject sexual coercion and at the same time embrace and celebrate fornication, contraception, masturbation, and same-sex sexual activity. For to reject nature when it comes to the latter behaviors is, in principle, to justify the rejection of nature with regard to the former, namely sexual coercion. But if you think it through, no reasonable person should want to consent to that. All right, so let's now turn to the second modern ethical principle. For sexual behavior, a sexual act is morally permissible as long as no one is harmed. We can call this the sex without harm principle. I also wrote an article on this issue entitled, "Is Sex Okay as Long as No One Gets Hurt?" And you can find that at Catholic.com. The previous ethical principle stated that the appeal to consent alone is a necessary condition for appropriate sexual behavior. A variant of the consent principle is what we might call the do no harm principle. Again, an act is morally permissible so long as it doesn't hurt anyone. I'm going to repeat that because I messed up. An act is morally permissible so long as it doesn't hurt anyone. There we have it. Richard Dawkins, famous atheist, applies this principle to sexual behavior in his book, The God Delusion. Here's what he writes. Enjoy your own sex life so long as it damages no one else, and leave others to enjoy theirs in private, whatever their inclinations, which are none of your business. So the question arises, is this principle, this do no harm principle, sufficient for evaluating human sexual behavior? Well, let's think it through. It's important to note that the principle is not entirely bad. There is a kernel of truth in it, inasmuch as human beings are naturally directed to live in society. We got to allow others to exercise their freedom to achieve the goods to which nature directs them: self-preservation, propagation of the species, knowledge, friendship, education, etc. Any attempt to unjustly impede someone from pursuing his natural goods, the goods that nature directs him to, would be an offense against the dignity of the person. It also would be an offense against the common good, because every innocent person is part of the common good. So this principle is partly true. So that, of course, raises the question, well, what's false about it? Well, we get a sense of its flaws when we apply it to non-sexual cases. Consider lying, for example, especially the kind exemplified in The Truman Show, a 1998 film starring Jim Carrey, whose character's entire life is a stage production that's broadcast on live television without him knowing it. Suppose The Truman Show was not just a movie, but was real life. Truman's entire world is a facade. His wife, neighborhood, friends, even the sea, sun, stars, and sky is a facade. All staged for TV viewers around the world. Now, why would this be wrong? After all, no one would be harmed. The character doesn't know he's being lied to. Everyone watching the show would be experiencing pleasure and enjoyment, as exemplified in the film. According to the do no harm principle, we'd have to say that nothing is wrong here with this scenario. But we do recognize it would be wrong. It might be fun to watch this plot play out on the big screen as a movie, but we wouldn't stand for such deception if it were a reality. So notice, we don't follow the do no harm, no foul principle in this matter. Consider the intent to murder. This is another example where we don't abide by the do no harm principle, or no harm, no foul principle. Suppose my neighbor plots to murder me, but for some unforeseen circumstance, he's unable to carry his plan out. Suppose further that I never find out. No harm done, right? And if no harm is done, well then according to this principle, no wrong is done. But I think all people of goodwill would agree that it's wrong to plot someone's murder, even if the circumstances later prevent it from happening. So we don't follow this principle in non-sexual matters, but we also don't follow this ethical principle when it comes to sexual cases or matters. For example, we don't justify an adulterous man by saying, what your wife doesn't know won't hurt her. Most of us say that adultery is morally wrong, even if the spouse never finds out, even if no harm is done. Likewise, a man who fantasizes about another woman during sexual relations with his spouse doesn't harm anybody. If he never tells his wife, she'll never know, so no harm, no wrong, right? Well, according to this ethical principle, we'd have to say no immorality because there's no harm involved. But I think everyone of goodwill intuitively recognizes that, no, that would be wrong. So we don't abide by this principle, even in sexual cases. Consider one last example. If a man drugged a girl to make her unconscious and then rapes her without her ever finding out, every person of goodwill would say that's wrong. That's immoral. Even if the creep didn't do any physical harm to the girl and the girl had no knowledge or memory of the act. The no harm, no wrong ethic would have no ground to stand on here. And every person of goodwill would recognize that. So again, we see that the no harm, no foul ethical principle isn't followed even within sexual matters. So why would we follow that principle when it comes to other sexual matters? So now someone might rebut that the perpetrator in the rape example harmed the girl by engaging in sex without her consent. But therein again, the defender of the traditional natural law, moral law, in its relation to sexual ethics couldn't be happier with such a rebuttal. Because there it extends, quote unquote, harm to something more than observable physical, emotional, or psychological damage. It sees harm in thwarting an end of a person's natural powers. In this case, a person's self-determining powers. But if the natural end or goal of our self-determining powers has moral significance for us, then so too the natural ends or goals of our biological sexual powers, such as the ends being procreation and union of spouses. So if the end of our rational powers is going to determine appropriate or inappropriate human behavior, we're happy with that, because that allows for the ends of our sexual powers to determine the appropriate or inappropriate human sexual behavior. Now, this leads me to my final point. Dawkins' principle of sexual ethics just begs the question against the defender of traditional natural moral law. It assumes that the sexual acts that contemporary culture permits, like contraception, same-sex sexual activity, masturbation, fornication, etc., it assumes they're morally permissible. But think about this. If such behaviors are contrary to our human good, as traditional natural law states they are, then they would damage the persons that engage in them. They would harm their moral character. Furthermore, by celebrating such behaviors and enshrining them as morally good, it would cause intellectual harm by leading others to think that they're moral human behaviors when in reality they're not. So Dawkins and others who follow him in this line of thinking simply beg the question against a defender of natural moral law. Now, there's more to the story than just avoiding physical, emotional, or psychological harm. The art of being human also involves avoiding moral harm and ordering our behavior in a way that's truly perfective of our nature as human beings. So, even with this modern ethical principle, and both of them that we've considered today, my dear friends, there is hope within our modern sex-crazed culture, because the principles involved, embedded within these modern sexual ethical principles, are actually the very principles that a traditional natural moral lawyer, right, would appeal to defend the claim that some sexual behaviors that our modern culture praises and supports are actually immoral as well. Well, my friends, that's all the time we have for this week's episode of The Catholic Reason. I hope you learned something today. Thank you so much for listening. Remember, you can download the show at my website, KarloBroussard.com, or subscribe to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast. I invite you to join me again next week. Tell a friend. I'll talk to you then. God bless.